Clapper bored you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, She Took the Explosion for the Predator Cub and Woke Up on a Throne She Never Wanted. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. The first thing she remembered was light. Not the warm light of a sunrise or the friendly hum of a station corridor, but a needle of white that stabbed behind her eyes and stitched her back together from pieces she didn't realize had blown apart. Captain Mira Halden tried to breathe and tasted copper, ash, and something sweet and mineral, like rain on hot stone. For a long time, the world was only edges, a curved ceiling of living metal, thin columns of vapor drifting toward a round skylight, the low, layered murmur of voices that weren't human. When the edges softened and depth returned, she saw tall figures in articulated armor standing in a circle around her, their helms molded into the faces of predators. Blunt muzzles, swept-back cheek spikes, narrow islets like slivers of night. The armor drank and returned the room's light in slow pulses that felt almost like breathing. She moved her fingers and heard tiny motors whisper inside her forearm. She moved her toes and felt the give of a surface that was not metal but some kind of flexing stone. She pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth and felt sutures that hadn't been made by human hands or human tools. A small shape pushed through the ring of armored figures, the only one without a helm. Golden eyes under a ridge of pale bone, gray fur with a blue sheen, a throat band heavy with tiny carved tablets. The creature looked like a juvenile version of the beasts molded on the armor, and the sight of it slammed her memory doors open. The evacuation sirens, the orbital warning, the cub crying and stumbling in the smoke while the gunship hammered the plaza with sonic bursts to scatter the raiders. Her sprint in defiance of her orders. The flash, so close the pulse grenade seemed to blossom inside her helmet, heat biting through armor, shearing bone, the child below her. She had twisted her body to shield it and seen a face raised to hers, wet and terrified, and against everything she had been taught to expect, pleading. Now the face was calmer, older in the posture if not the features. The cub stepped close and sniffed the air beside her cheek, as if smelling for someone who had left. "You should be dead," it said in rolling tonal basic that made the consonants sound like river stones under soft water. Working on it, Mira croaked, and the ring of guards tensed as if laughter might be a weapon. She gathered breath like coins and spent it carefully. "Where am I?" "In the Hall of Ascendance," said the cub. He straightened so that the light caught the tiny tablets at his throat. "On Threx Prime." The name radiated heat into her chest. Human briefings had painted the Threx as an empire of hunters, a culture built on testing the strong, a biology tuned to predation, a history carved with invasion and counterinvention in uneven strips. Marines memorized their silhouettes, bent legs, coiled strength, heavy shoulders, and their battlefield habits, flanking swarms, probing feints, sudden axial charges. But the same briefings always ended with an odd caution. Do not underestimate their concepts of kin, honor, or the debt of protection. The Threx were predators, yes, but they were not mindless. Mira fought the fog. How long? 17 cycles, said the cub, and when she blinked he translated. 29 standard days. 29 days since heat had hollowed her, since she felt her heartbeat pause between halves of a second and fear decide to let go. She looked down at herself. Soft slate fabric bound her torso in layers that read like both robe and armor. Her left arm from elbow to wrist was a lattice of matte plates veined with a dim violet glow, and when she flexed the fingers, the joints unfurled in silence. Under the skin of her right forearm, something like quicksilver shifted and warmed. She pressed and felt a ripple move away, as if a small school of fish fled under a sheet of ice. She raised her eyes to the cub. "What did you do to me?" He said, "You did it to yourself, Sovereign." The word fell between them like a piece of iron, The armored ring exhaled in a whisper of servos, a shared motion like wind through grass. The cub lowered his head and to her shock knelt, palm-down claws extended on the stone. "You took our right to its end," he said, and the tone in his basic made right glow with capital letters. "When the prow strike tore the plaza and the dome fell, our defenders were broken, and he hesitated, as if choosing how much to admit to the alien on the stone. "My bloodline would have ended there." The shard answered as it must, but it found no Threx vessel fit enough near me, for they had fallen. It found you. It bound itself to you and you to me. By such fusions are continuances kept. He looked up, gold on gray. "The right will be honored, Sovereign." Mira tried to sit up on a surge of adrenaline and found herself already vertical, body leaping to obey a command it hadn't decided to issue. The guards shifted, not forward but outward, making more room, as if she were larger than she had been. "I am not your sovereign," she said carefully. The cub rose with the same grace. "You bled for a Threx. You chose to place your body between death and a cub who smelled of my bloodline. The shard knows intent. It would not choose a coward, and it does not choose twice." Mira released a long, incomplete breath. "Who are you?" "Rawkin," he said. "Heir that lived by a debt I will never finish paying." He lifted one arm and the room shifted focus like a camera setting depth. From the circular walls, from gently inclined platforms and walkways, more Threx stepped into view. Some wore the Predator helms. Some carried rods etched with dense script. A few wore draped fabrics that made their silhouettes less blade-like, and their movements closer to dance than war. At the far end of the hall, a throne of black gold bone rose in layered crescents, its arms ending in the stylized heads of some great animal with the teeth left unfiled. Mira's eyes skated off the throne. She found herself regarding instead a smaller figure at its base. An elder in woven silver, face unhelmed, eyes steady. The elder's nostrils flared as if taking her measure in scent instead of sight. Rawkin lifted both hands and spoke not to Mira but to the room. His language unfolded in flourishes that Mira's implanted translator tried and failed to keep up with. She caught half-meanings, continuance. Right, debt, bridge, human. At a cue Mira couldn't detect, every Threx present lowered on one knee. The sound of armor touching stone in a circle that wide was like rain rippling through a cavern lake. Mira felt her throat narrow with the urge to shout that they had the wrong woman. She was a Marine who had disobeyed orders, not a symbol to hang a survival on. She bit the shout down and let the wave of motion break around her. When the Threx rose, the elder at the base of the throne stepped forward. "I am Kajal," he said in careful basic. "Archkeeper of rights. The shard that saved Rawkin has braided itself with your living and your dying. It rests now where Threx rulers carry their birthright, between the heart and the will." He tapped his chest with 2 fingers. "I'm human," Mira said, as if that explained a border no stone could bridge. "And the shard is not Threx," Kajal said softly. "It is older than names. It has served many peoples who grew and lost themselves and passed their songs to air." Rawkin extended a hand. Claws retracted. His palm looked almost human for a moment. "Walk," he said. Mira found her legs under her. As she stepped off the dais, something inside her matched frequency with the energy under the stone. The floor wasn't just floor, it was part of a larger body, a kind of sensate network. When she walked, she heard, not with her ears, a resonant hum singing along her bones. The world seemed carved for joints she had just acquired. They walked through a colonnade where arcs of metal grew like branches from the walls, and curved toward one another in symmetrical patterns Mira instinctively recognized as load-bearing, like ribs grown to cradle a heart. Through a glazed spillway, she saw the capital beyond. A tiered city balanced on terraces that caught the light and threw it back, river channels carving through them in intentional geometry, so that the smallest eddies were part of a larger current. The buildings looked like bones grown with a sculptor's intention, hollowed with thin windows that drank the blue sky. Long walkways arced like the path of migrating birds. At the edges, past growing fields that looked like silver grass, reared the broken segments of the old dome, blasted open. Mira saw the plaza and felt again the grenade's heat. They stopped at a balcony open to the wind. Rawkin laid his hand on the rail, claws tracing a notch as if it were a worry stone. "You saved my life," he said. "You stopped one ending and created two beginnings, yours and what becomes of us because you did not let me die." "I broke orders," Mira said, and the wind pasted her hair against her cheek. "I made a decision my admiral would call indulgent. He'd say the plaza demanded evacuating Marines, not a Threx cub. He'd say the strike cleansed the area of enemy assets." She laughed once, empty of humor. "We always make it sound clean. You think that because you were made sovereign, your people will think you betrayed them," said Kajal. "They won't think it," Mira said. "It'll be in the charge summary: treason, collaboration, interference in an authorized action." Rawkin's whiskers angled downward. "They will come to collect you. They will come to conquer you," Kajal said, gaze on the city. Mira breathed the wind until its chill made clarity feel like an instrument. "Then we need to survive the moment without killing the future we might have instead. Do you understand that kind of future? The kind you cannot reach by charging it." Rawkin's gold eyes held hers for a long second. "We hunted before we farmed," he said. "We learned to wait before we learned to make. I can understand." She looked at the city and the broken dome and her hands that belonged to her and not to her. "Then listen to me, and when your generals bark you still your ears." That was the day she became a thing she never wanted. Not a queen by their word, sovereign was not queen in their language, but something like a focal point where two currents met. She asked questions with no softness and demanded answers with no title. She learned how Threx commanders signaled speed and which signals meant patience. She walked the fields with builders who made food from threads of nutrient drawn up like dew. She sat with the line elders who could recite a bloodline to 100 names and listened to where their voices cracked when they said they're dead. She practiced standing still at the balcony until standing still felt like an act worthy of calling a skill, because everything in her human training howled to move, push, pull, seize initiative, strike before they can strike you. Sometimes strength is waiting long enough to see which way fear leans. The fleet arrived 31 days later. They came in a subtle wedge because wedges were honest about what they intended. 5 carriers with long spines, 14 cruisers, and a screen of drone tenders. The fleet preferred doctrine and doctrine preferred clarity. At the heart of the wedge, where humans always put a name that frightened their enemies and comforted their own, came the TSS Resilience. Admiral Keen had taught Mira how to hold formation and how to look at a holographic battle space and know the 3 things it hid. He had also taught her to make tea that tasted like boiled socks and to wedge her boots under a station bar to sleep without drifting. He had held her gaze after the St. Cyril Messi rescue and said quietly, "We keep people alive or else we aren't worth the air we steal." She had believed him enough to die to keep a cub breathing. He was the one voice she wanted to hear and the last one she was ready to face. Their message burned a straight line through the sky. It wasn't voice first. It was a text order that could survive jamming and distortion. "Captain Mira Halden, by authority of Terran Command, you are ordered to report for immediate extraction. You are charged with treason, collaboration with hostile forces, dereliction of duty, and interference with authorized Operation Clean Switch. You will comply. Tal is to be determined in tribunal." The Threx generals read it in the translation as if sniffing a blade before deciding where to push. "They insult you," one murmured. "They name me what their law says," Mira said. Her voice sounded like it came from a helmet she hadn't put on. "If I go alone, they will still fire on your shields as they leave to show their teeth to themselves. If I refuse, they will come down with steel first because they believe they have the right to bring me by force. Rawkin's hands tightened on the balcony rail until the metal formed a shallow crescent. What do you choose to do? Mira didn't answer. She closed her eyes and called the thing in her chest a name that wasn't a word. She hadn't known how at first. The shard had been a whisperer then, a current moving through the periphery of her senses, teaching her its grammar by the way the city lights thickened when she was tired and thinned when she laughed. Now she could feel its attention like a cat's weight stepping from bone to bone along her ribs. When she asked, it showed her, not in images but in shapes, the place where the city's great shield drew itself. The shield wasn't a dome slapped over them like some human garrison model. It was a membrane grown from the resonance of things that wanted to be one thing for a while. I'm going to stand in front of your shield and ask both armies to look me in the eye, she said. Kajal made a sound that might have been amusement and might have been sorrow. And if one refuses, then I will look only at the other, Mira said, and opened her eyes. They gathered at the city's edge where the terraces fell away in steps like the back of a huge sleeping animal. The shield thickened there into slow surf. Threk's archers, who had never seen a Terran vessel, not in crosshairs, stood shoulder to shoulder with engineers, who could make food from mist, and children who watched with their tails wrapped around their ankles, learning things no one wanted to have to teach them. The air smelled like copper and rain, and the faint acid tang of ships spooling. Mira walked out past the line where any sane commander would allow a representative to stand. She kept walking until the shield's surf rose and ran a blistering hand along her armor. She set her boots on the last terrace and looked up. The sky was a machine of angles. The wedge burned high and clean. A dot detached from the Resilience's flank and became a shuttle, then a spear, then a presence angling toward her like a question you did not answer unless you accepted the terms it hid. Mira lifted a hand. The shard inside her uncoiled and laced itself into her bones. A pulse rippled from her palm and became something you could not diagram on a tactics board because it wasn't force and it wasn't signal. It was suggestion at the level where suggestion becomes geometry. The shuttle's skin shivered and remembered it was metal. Metal remembered inclusive heat equations. Heat remembered its own fear of leaving equilibrium. Velocity remembered its bargains. The shuttle slowed as a man frowns, not because it cannot do otherwise, but because its intent changed at a level it cannot narrate. It hung above her at a polite height and slowly extended landing struts. A thin ladder unfolded. A figure in a pressure-black longcoat edged with rank bands climbed down and stepped onto Threk's stone as if it were an airlock. Mira felt all the small things you keep as a human. An ache where an old scar tightens in the cold, the way your molars want to meet, the peculiar contentment in the hinge of your thumb, say Admiral. Captain, he said. His voice was rough sand. He didn't say her name, and miraculously the not saying made tenderness survive. Admiral Keen, she said. He studied her without trying to hide it. He took in the latticework vambrace that pulsed under her skin's thin sheen, the plated pauldrons that didn't belong to any human design, the posture that had learned to share itself with a city. His eyes flicked to the Threk's lines and back. We sent you to keep a corridor open for our evac, he said, as if building a floor between them made it less likely one of them would fall. And we got a sovereign. You sent me to keep people alive, Mira said. I did that. I will continue to do that until one of us makes it impossible. Keen's gaze rested on the shield membrane's slow breath. You can't stay here, Halden. Everyone thinks they can be the exception when a war machine starts to climb the hill. It makes teeth from whatever is nearest. Then don't give it me, Mira said. Turn it aside before someone feeds it and calls that discipline. A quiet, almost human sound behind her told her Rawkin had leaned forward, listening. Keen's head tipped the way it did when he was parsing 3 kinds of truth at once. I have orders. They say I am to bring you aboard. Dismantle this city's offensive network and restore deterrence. We will not attack your worlds, Rawkin said. His basic placed the stress in odd places that made promises feel like they had corners you could hang weight on. You have my word, and mine is not alone. Keen didn't flinch at the voice. He had stood before aliens on decks of ships that had 3 gravity planes and listened without blinking. He kept his eyes on Mira. The politicians will ask me what you are to the Threx, he said. If I cannot describe it in a way they understand, they will assume you've been captured in the oldest way. I am their bridge, Mira said simply. To what? To a future where we do not waste our children, she said. Wind moved and the shield's membrane dimmed and brightened in answer like a lung. Keen looked very tired. You always did like to take the awkward route, he said softly. You were a mule in officer's boots. Mira surprised herself by smiling. You loved that mule, sir. I did, he said, and grief washed across his face so nakedly she had to glance away. You died in my log, and then you sent a transmission to say, in essence, that the log was wrong. Mira lifted her left hand. The latticework plates sighed open like petals and bled light that had nothing to do with electricity. I did die, she said, and then someone built a lever out of that death and moved a future with it. Keen's hands flexed as if an invisible tether wanted them to do something practical. Let me take you aboard, he said, very quietly, as if saying it softer changed the demand into a favor. Let me write the report that says I prevented a long war in a short hour because I met courage with discretion. If I go, Mira said, this city will bleed. Not in numbers you would call total, Admiral, but in ways that become prophecies. You will damage what your children's children could have eaten at. I can't put you in that story. If you refuse, Keen said, the hawks will fly and the hawks' handlers will call it inevitable. Mira stepped closer until she saw the micro-texture of his long coat. I will stand here until both of our machines have to go recharge, she said. Kill me and your machine can call the mission complete. Don't kill me, and maybe the machine learns that sometimes it can turn around. She let the words hang, memory weights on a small rope bridge she hoped would hold. You taught me how to recognize a hill you wouldn't climb because you'd be something else at the top. He closed his eyes. Somewhere far above, a ship's long spine adjusted, relays feeding power into capacitors, currents choosing quick or steady. He stood inside his orders like a man standing inside rain. When he opened his eyes again, they were the tired of a captain who had counted names at 2 in the morning and then muttered the numbers to a ceiling panel. 2 days, he said hoarsely. Show me that the Threx can hold their claws. Show me that they will dismantle the launchers you do not need to defend a city. Show me a world that has more marketplaces than parade grounds. He jerked his head toward the sky. I will hold the wedge as far back as my flag will obey. I will call it targeting recalibration and pretend we forgot how to aim. You will be accused of weakness, Rawkin said. They accuse me of that already when I count us after, Keen said, and the heat of the words told Mira that weakness was what he called strength when no one else was listening. Those 2 days might have been weeks for how long they stretched. Mira did not sleep. The shard hummed low and steady as if singing to the foundation stones. Rawkin moved through the city with the kind of steady attention that made people stand taller without remembering they had chosen to. Kajal worked like a trickle of water does, in the same direction without stops, knowing what stone it would wear smooth in a month and which in a year. Launchers on the outer terraces were rolled into cradles and sealed with resin that could be cut in an hour if treachery became necessary again. But the seals were public, and the ceremony said aloud that they were trust, not neglect. Hunters took their practice into the hills instead of the streets. For the first time, children ran on a bridge over the irrigation channels without stepping around a rack of rifles. It was not peace, not yet, but it was a rehearsal in which everyone remembered their cue because their lives had written the lines. On the third day, when the light came up the color of a bruise, the wedge tilted and drew away from the blue of Threx Prime like a ship leaving a dreamed shore. Admiral Keen's last transmission was 7 words: "Keep them alive, mule." Then a pause: "Keep yourself alive too." Mira stood until the wedge's heat faded from the upper atmosphere and only the clean wind touched her cheeks. She did not cry. Some griefs you don't drain because you'd never stop. The quiet years were not quiet. They were simply loud in different registers. Mira learned the city's true language, which wasn't spoken. It was exchange and structure. Which terrace you repaired first said who you expected to return. Which fields you seeded with staple and which with fruit said who you thought would be alive to eat the second harvest. Which stories you carved on the plinth outside the hall said whether your children would grow teeth or hands first. She became, by walking it daily, the thing the Threx had named her: bridge. She was stone and span and a polished rail. She took the weight of feet and wheels and claws and swallowed it without complaint. She learned to absorb and transmit without drawing attention to herself as the path. It wasn't humility, it was engineering. A bridge that asked for acknowledgement was not well designed. A bridge that spoke loudly wasn't doing its job. Sometimes she strapped her armor on and went out with small teams to resolve border quarrels where words got thin. The armor responded now like a second body, not a suit. It drank the planet's field lines and fed them back when she raised a hand. She tried not to raise her hand for violence. When she had to, she used force like a doctor uses a blade, with respect for what she could reopen. Word spread among the rougher lines that the human sovereign was not to be trifled with, not because she would kill you if you tried, but because she would see you, and then you would have to see yourself. Word also spread that she visited the nesting grounds every season, and helped ban the first litters so they could be tracked and protected. That she sat with hunters who had lost limbs to raids, and taught them Terran toolbox tricks to relearn balance. That she let children climb the lower struts of her pauldrons, while she told them stories of ships that hummed like bees and stations, where the sunlight came through in slices you could set your clock by. News reached her sometimes from human space. Keen's signals were rare, coded in disciplines even Mira hadn't known he trafficked in. The gist was always the same: I am keeping you as my ace and my conscience. The Hawks are loud, but they have to argue with our grandchildren's hunger now. Keep proving them wrong. After 7 years, enemies who had never met Mira decided she was a myth. Myths are comforting until they make a mistake of being real. If you cut a myth and it bleeds, you have to decide whether to grant it personhood or kill it harder. A cluster of warlords in the Perseid Reach chose the latter. They saw a human holding a predator city in a posture that wasn't a bow and declared that posture an insult. They brought heat knives and envoys that smiled without showing teeth. When they were rebuffed, they unrolled a new doctrine: not conquest, which sounded old, but liberation, which plays better on certain channels. They would, they said, liberate the Threx from human contagion. They would liberate Mira from a throne that had trapped a warm-blooded mammal in a snake's den. They would, in short, set everyone free by breaking all the things that made the freedom mean anything. Mira and Rawkin read the communiques in the long orange evening at the top of the hall. They will try the old trick, he said. Kill the symbol and the structure collapses. Then we make the structure hold without me, Mira said. You say that as if it were simple, Kajal murmured. It is simple, Mira said, and hard. It's teaching a hand to open when it has learned to close. She went to the fields and walked with the cedars, made the plan for what you plant when you don't know if your stores will survive the winter. She taught the defenders how Terrans laid out defense in depth with civilian corridors braided through so that the enemy feared harming those they needed later to barter with. She sat with the apprentices in the foundries and traced with her finger in grease the design of a fuse that failed safe. She told stories in the nesting grounds about heroes who were not soldiers. The water diver who learned how to dig a vent because she watched bubbles. the archivist who stored a line of music in the bones of a bridge beam so it would hum the song into rain. When the warlords came, their doctrine unwound like a poorly tied knot. They expected to find a city that was a pulsing heart they could punch. They found instead a network that flexed. They found defenders who fought like a kind of stubborn weather, hard and then gone, back, and then nowhere you could pin. They found a population that did not panic when the first power cut came because someone had taught them how to live for a while like it was a different century. Ships that fired indiscriminately into the terraces lost aim in an instant when they felt their own guidance systems pause, remember to be metal, and choose equilibrium instead of bravado. Mira did fight. At the river crossing where the raiders tried to force a spear of light through the shield's membrane, she waded in up to her waist and held, armor drinking current like a dam's face. At the western gullies, she sat with a fire team and mapped the places where you let the enemy run fast because the fast line leads to mud. At the citadel, she stood still, while a sniper sighted down and watched the bullet deform into vapor in the air 2 meters from her face, because she asked the air to remember how heavy it was, and the bullet remembered physics are not impressed by anger. They could not, win everywhere. The southern terraces burned for a day and a night until the city's own stones went white like teeth and split rather than let the flame run further. 2 schools fell because the raiders had heard the stories of the sovereign and wanted the echo of breaking a place she loved. Mira found the rubble and dug with her hands until the skin split and healed and split again. She found 38 bodies. She found 4 living. She did not speak for 2 days after, because the words in her throat were all knives. There are battles that end because one side wins and another yields. This one ended because everyone ran out of the thing that made their doctrine make sense. The warlords could spend more soldiers, but none of them wanted to be the one who explained to their backers why the casualty curves bent upward and the objective curves wobbled like a drink in a hand someone couldn't stop shaking. They retreated, and in the retreat they broadcast slogans because slogans are cheap. The slogans said what slogans always say when people want to hide the ache of having decided wrong: inevitable, necessary, temporary, righteous. Mira stood on the smoke line and let the wind blacken her hair. She could feel the shard like a condensation on a cold glass. It had changed with her. Where it had once sung only of structure and resonance, it now hummed of grief like a tone you can only hear if you are bone-tired and honest. She put her hand on a broken wall and felt in the pattern of its cracks the history of the pressure that had opened them, where the heat had surged and been denied, where the stone admitted an old mistake and made a new virtue of being able to split without collapsing entirely. That night she dreamed of Admiral Keen's hands and woke with the knowledge that she would not live forever like this. The shard had bound a human body to an old engine and made a useful machine. Old engines have maintenance cycles. Human bodies have a kindness in them that keeps going even after logic says to stop, but kindness has limits too. She understood, very simply, that she would one day stop. She told Rawkin on the balcony as the eastern fields lit with the moving lines of workers placing new seed. "I will leave before I rot from the inside," she said, "because some things require a small cruelty in the way you phrase them so no one mistakes them for melodrama." "You are not rotting," he said, sounding for the first time since she'd met him like a youngling who had not learned where to place his fear. "You are bright. You are the hum the stones learned so they could hold up our roofs." "If I stay until I dim," she said, "you will keep me because love confuses itself. If I go while I can still walk, you will understand that walking is a gift I got to keep." Kajal did not argue. He simply asked, "When?" "When the shard stops singing and starts only listening," Mira said. "When I can no longer teach children to tie the harness so that it doesn't chafe." That winter was kind. That spring was not. Animals birthed early and stumbled in late frosts. Air cleaved to the city like wet cloth. Mira's armor felt heavier. The shard pulsed but lacked echo. She would ask it to bend the light and it would answer a hair after the request, like a tired friend roused from a nap. She still went out, because not going out would have been a sermon no one needed. But she went with a team and let the younger ones with skin like fresh beads of rain push to the front. A rumor reached them that the Admiralty had changed hands. Keene retired. The Hawks preened before a new mirror. The peace would hold if people who paid attention worked to keep it, and would fail if people who only counted things that shone set the metrics. Mira smiled in private and did not allow the bitterness to burn the back of her throat. You cannot watch children learn to balance on a bridge rail and remain cynical. Her last act of office, though she refused to call it that, was to walk the city alone. She started at the shield membrane and laid her palm against it as if feeling a fever. She walked the terraces in a slow spiral until each face she knew saw her and thought not of death but of work to do. She knelt at the schools and told a story in quiet basic about a mule that carried a pile of stones up a muddy hill because the hill needed to be a path for people to go home on. She stood in the foundries and let heat paint her cheeks. She spoke with the line elders and listened while they repeated her own sentences back to her in Threx syntax, which made even her mistakes sound like proverbs. When she finished the circle, she climbed to the Hall of Ascendance and sat on the steps, not the throne. The throne had never liked her. It wasn't personal. It was an engineering mismatch. She needed a place a person could rise from without feeling like they insulted something carved before their grandparents' breathed. The steps suited. Rawkin came the way he always did, quietly, as if he could make himself a shadow that cast light. Kajal moved across the floor like a line being drawn with infinite patience. "I am leaving," Mira said. The words felt clean and surgical and left a tenderness behind. "There will be ceremonies," Kajal said. Mira shook her head. "No, there will be work. The ceremony would tell the lie that I was the thing that held this together. I was only ever the tool some stubborn hands used." Rawkin went to his knees not in the old rite, but because he needed ground. "You saved my life," he said. "You saved it again and again until saving became not a choice for you but the way you breathe." "I also learned to stop," Mira said, "or else saving becomes stealing." They held silence like a cloth between them. She stood. The armor reshaped one last time to fit how she wanted to wear it, not regal, not terrifying, simply present. Mira stepped into the hall's center and called the shard with everything she had left. It answered like a bell in a distant town. She raised her hands and felt it unthread itself from her like a bead curtain parting to let an old friend through. For an instant she was thinner than herself, arranged lightly around a core that was leaving. She thought she might fall, and then realized she already was falling in a direction that wasn't down. Light lifted from her, not bright, not the flash of weapons, but the kind that windows make when storm clouds move and sunlight finds the one clean line. The Threx in the room smelled the change and lowered their heads. Kajal began to sing under his breath in a scale that matched the city's power lines. Mira felt the shard's last touch brush her collarbone as if to say this was never ownership, only a loan we liked. "Be kind to them," she whispered, not sure whether she meant the Threx or the humans or the warlord's children. "Be kind even when kindness hurts." She spoke without lips. She spoke into the breath between stones. The light lifted. Her cells remembered how to vacate. The armor dropped in a quiet rearrangement and held her shape for a moment before gravity did its job. Rawkin lunged forward and caught the empty, suddenly too heavy thing. He lowered it as if it were a sleeping animal. Mira was not in the room to see the way the city's lights grew softer for an instant, as if grieving. She was in the membrane and the terraces and the long ribs of the hall. She was in the irrigation channels and the fuse boxes. She was in the teaching phrases children repeated to themselves when they practiced not falling. She was in the memories of a man in a long coat who stared out a viewport and said aloud to no one, "You mule, you stubborn miracle, thank you." Years made calm corridors and sudden storms. The warlords learned boredom, and boredom made them look inward at their accounts and ask different questions about profit. The Threks learned to walk farther into markets without flinching. Humans learned to visit with lighter armor and heavier pockets. There were fights. There are always fights, but there were also harvest festivals where a line of younglings in carved masks performed a story dance about a human who had not been a queen, but had told kings how to carry their crowns without breaking their necks. There were new bridges with handrails at the right height for human fingers and Threx claws both. There were infants born whose names, on both sides, meant something like endure. Rawkin ruled until the fur at his neck went white in crescents. He refused the throne more often than not and held court on the steps, and everyone understood why. He kept one rule stricter than all. If you argue for war, you must also be the one to deliver the bread to the mothers by the river while the first alarms are going. It cut down on a certain flavor of speech. Ka-Zhul lived to a great age and spent his last afternoons in the school courtyards, letting toddlers climb his shins while he told them not to worship tools. He said instead, "Love what the tools made possible and pass them on clean." Visitors from the Terran fleet came and went. Some were blunt instruments wearing faces and some were decent. Every few years an envoy would stop at the statue in the hall, no throne at her back in its design, only steps, and then step back without kneeling because kneeling is not our practice, and you don't impose your practice on someone else's sacred. They would look for a long time. They would see the hand on a small predator cub's head and the other open as if measuring the breadth of something unseen. They would read the inscription, which in basic said simply, "She stood." Stories told in low voices traveled outward like seeds blown into good ditch soil. Some said she was alive still in a hidden chamber, sleeping. Some said she had been a machine from the start. Some said she'd been a fanatic, a traitor, a saint, a fool. The children didn't care. They knew the part that mattered. Someone can refuse the shape that's handed to them and make a new one that holds more lives. That story, once told, grows legs. On the 50th anniversary of the day of the blast, a storm came off the northern highlands with a spine of white lightning and a jaw of black rain. The city folded itself into rain shapes without panic. Rain shapes are a winter thing you learn by breaking windows once and then making them stronger. People took shelter in the halls and told one another stories not because they were scared, but because people are what stories do to sound. The storm bent above the hall and thunder cracked like a ship's spine, and someone said, very softly so it didn't feel like superstition, "She's reminding us to fix the west sluice before spring." At dawn, the storm broke its back on the eastern hills. The clouds thinned to veils, and the sky behind them showed the pale of morning. At the edge of a flooded courtyard, a child crouched and touched the water with 3 fingers the way Mira had taught in a long-ago lesson. Test first, then trust. The child laughed at the cold and ran along the plinth steps shouting for friends. Life resumes because that is what it does. Somewhere far from Threx Prime, aboard a quiet ship retired to a slow orbit around an amber dwarf, a very old man poured tea and made a face at how it still tasted like socks. He lifted the cup anyway and looked at the star. "We kept them alive," Admiral Keene said to the empty room, and in the silence afterwards something like an echo answered, not in sound, not even in thought, but in the way the tea steam turned in a circle that matched the curve of the ship's window. It was enough. In the end, there is no end. There is only a widening of the place where you can stand without needing armor to be loved. There is only the slow training of hands to unclench. There is only the sound of rain on different roofs and the remembering of names. The galaxy runs on stories measured not in victories, but in how many children get to grow old enough to tell them. A human woman once took an explosion meant for predator cub because, at the moment that mattered, species and sides were less real than a small body shivering in smoke. She woke on a throne she never wanted, and she climbed down from it again and again until climbing down became the lesson. In the years that followed, she taught a city to breathe differently. She taught an empire that hunting is not the highest expression of strength. She taught her own people that courage is not obedience and disobedience is not always betrayal. She died not as a queen but as a bridge, and bridges, once built, outlast the builders if they are made of the right things. On quiet nights, when the wind crosses the terraces and the membrane hums exactly the right note and a child in a high window laughs at the shape lightning made, older ears swear they can hear footsteps on stone, steady and stubborn, like a mule climbing a hill with stones on its back. No one is frightened by that sound. They sleep better hearing it. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.